Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about what's next with autonomous vehicles.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, President of the National Press Foundation. Today we're helping journalists understand where things stand with autonomous vehicles. There are many challenges ahead, even as a handful of self-driving vehicles are being road tested. With us today in the studio, Kelly Donahue, a lawyer for Wilkinson, Barker, Nauer, Catherine McCullough of the Intelligent Car Coalition, and Courtney Rosen, a reporter for Bloomberg Government. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So Nuro just won government approval to run a low-speed autonomous delivery vehicle. So I guess we can look for this vehicle in your neighborhood soon. Waymo, the self-driving car service designed by Google, is up and running in Phoenix. And Pittsburgh has seen a swarm of companies test driving AVs. So if you have questions, send them to us at NapPress. And welcome again. And Catherine, why don't we get started with an overview of the AV marketplace?
Sure. Thanks, Sandy. It's a really interesting marketplace. I mean, obviously we started down this road, pardon the pun, several years ago, coming up with these autonomous vehicles technologies. And now we're seeing them get into cars and even vehicles like the one that you mentioned before, such as Nuro. And it's a really interesting point in the evolution. It's kind of where we are now is a maturing of these technologies to a certain degree. We're taking them from kind of the dream stage, we're moving on to the testing stage, and we're getting into the nitty-gritty of some of these issues, such as, what does it mean when we're talking about safety in autonomous vehicles? What does it mean when we're talking about regulation of autonomous vehicles? And we're also working out some of these issues that surround autonomous vehicles, such as AI, data, and connectivity.
So Kelly, what's the difference between connected and autonomous vehicles?
Sure. Sandy, thanks so much for having me on today's program. There's a lot of excitement surrounding autonomous vehicles, and you hear a lot about it in the news and the press, but there's a lot of advancements and excitement surrounding connected vehicle technologies as well, in part because we have connected vehicle technologies in our cars today. And the primary difference really between connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles is how the vehicle gets its data. With connected vehicle technology, the data is being received and transmitted to and from the vehicle through wireless technologies. So for example, satellite technologies, Wi-Fi, cellular technologies, enabling applications that assist in navigation, in parking assistance, roadside assistance, as compared to autonomous vehicle technology, where the technology within the car is gathering information based on sensors placed on the vehicle. So it's using those resident technologies to aid the vehicle in the dynamic driving task.
Thank you, Kelly. So we have a brief video here from the Intelligent Car Coalition about the different levels of automation.
What is an autonomous car? Usually when someone hears autonomous car, they picture a vehicle driving itself, without a human at the wheel. Perhaps this car can be summoned through an app or is part of a fleet of automated taxis. But you might drive a vehicle with automated features before that. In fact, one may be sitting in your driveway right now. That's because there are actually different levels of automation. The US government defines 5 levels based on who does what, when. At level 0, the human driver does everything. At level 1, an automated system can sometimes assist the driver conduct some parts of the driving task, such as automated emergency braking. At level 2, the system can actually conduct some parts of the driving task, such as speed and steering, while the human monitors the driving environment and performs the rest of the driving task. At level 3, vehicles are able to monitor the environment around them and use their systems to actually conduct the driving task in some instances. However, the human driver must be ready to take back control. At level 4, automated systems can conduct the driving task and monitor the environment, and the human need not take back control, but the system can operate only under certain conditions, such as a highway. Level 5 is a fully automated vehicle that can perform all driving tasks under all conditions. The technology for this fully driverless vision should soon be available in a few years. And that's good, because driver behavior causes almost all road fatalities, usually because drivers are impaired, speeding, unbelted, or drive off the road. In the meantime, vehicles with automated functions are beginning to save lives, not to mention time, emissions, and money today.
Thank you for that video, Catherine. So, Courtney, bring us up to speed with the current state of play with rules and regulations.
So the way that the regulations shake out right now are for traditional cars. So cars with steering wheels, cars with brakes, pedals. And so what a lot of these AV companies are trying to test are cars that don't necessarily have the traditional car elements. And so there's not regulation or legislation or a framework for that yet. And so that's what Congress is trying to tackle right now, to create some kind of framework for regulators eventually to create rules around self-driving cars.
Let's talk about DOT first, the Department of Transportation. Where do their regulations stand?
So the regulator over the Department of Transportation that's in charge of cars is NHTSA, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Their regulation at this point, I wouldn't call it regulation necessarily. The approach under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration has been to put out guidance documents. They call them AV 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. And those documents lay out how NHTSA, the auto regulators, see self-driving technology, but they don't necessarily have teeth, so they're not necessarily telling you this is how you run a car, how we want you to run a car. This is not how we want you to run a car. So the statements from DOT and from NHTSA at this point have been very much guidance, not necessarily firm regulation.
Catherine, what's your view of where the guidance stands?
I agree with all that. I think the interesting part about the regulation here is that you're seeing a traditionally mechanical technology, the automotive field, being looked at through the lens of a digital regulation. So, I think what we're seeing here is almost a blend of the traditional automotive regulation and a more a regulation that has more to do with tech policy. And certainly, with tech policy, the reason why you have fewer kind of top-down government dictated standards is because the product there is much more iterative. It moves really faster than the pace of innovation, faster than the pace of normal research and development for vehicles. So I think that you're seeing almost a blending of these two regulatory strategies, and I think there's still some negotiation over that. In other words, if you are regulating a product that is entirely digital, someone's life might not be in danger. Whereas if you're regulating a physical product, a mechanical product like a vehicle, there are obviously questions about life and limb to contend with. And so there are many interesting questions about, well, if we regulate it the way we do traditional cars in a slow kind of top-down strategy, will we create the kind of innovations that save lives? And will that kind of regulation be too slow to get that life-saving technology to the market? And I think right now we're at a very interesting place in terms of regulation, where everybody's trying to find that sweet spot so that we get the advantage of all of these innovations and we don't slow them down to the point where we are hurting their potential.
Mm-hmm. And the companies that are building AV cars and trying to understand what might come out of the regulatory process or the congressional process, how do they cope with the unknown?
It's a great question. I mean, it's difficult for them to cope with the unknown, and you have two separate industries who have their own separate kind of regulatory culture who are trying to grapple with all of this. I mean, if you think about it, the tech companies are not used to dealing with DOT, they're not used to dealing with NHTSA, and vice versa. The traditional OEMs, what we think of as the auto companies, they're not used to dealing with FTC-style rules over data and privacy and maybe FCC rules over connectivity. And so we're seeing kind of a coming together of three cultures almost around these issues, and certainly different ideas about expectations on regulation and different ideas about, how do we provide accountability, how do we create trust in the consumer while also bringing these products to marketplace in a capitalist system where, you obviously these private companies are doing it with the hopes that at some point they're going to, make a profit. So it's interesting, it's easy for me to say because I'm not one of these companies, but it's interesting to watch folks come together and negotiate these very important policy debates.
Well, I know many of the car companies belong to your coalition, and I guess we've seen some interesting partnerships between some of those companies in recent months and years.
Well,
Go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just going to say there are a lot of partnerships going on. And so my coalition has at different times had different members, and some of them together and some of them not, depending on where they are on the issues. So car companies have been part of that, but also in the past, tech companies such as Intel, folks like Verizon and AT&T, connectivity companies. So, my coalition, not right now, but at different times has, kind of had all these folks at the table talking to each other and trying to get an understanding of these issues from each other's perspectives. And yes, we have seen that part of that dynamic that you've just discussed, where you have OEMs kind of at the top of the
OEM?
original equipment manufacturers, so the auto companies. If you think about what goes into a vehicle, traditional vehicles contain about 50,000 parts, sometimes north of that. So the OEMs are essentially the end assembler of all of those parts, and they have to deal with that entire supply chain. They have to deal with all of the suppliers. They take over branding. They take over liability. They're a whole. It's a unique space that this for this player in this stakeholder in the marketplace. You have to put a lot of capital out there, obviously, and you have hopefully certain thoughts about how all these parts are going to fit together. And how you're going to come up with a profit at the end of the day from these products. So their relationships with these suppliers has changed quite a bit. In the past, automotive suppliers were just traditional automotive suppliers. Now you have folks who are tech company giants who are essentially in the position of being automotive suppliers, but they also hold technologies and patents on technologies that are more crucial for the deployment of autonomous and electric and connected vehicles than had been true in the past. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think everybody's kind of learning as stakeholders how to get along in this environment.
Courtney, tell us what's going on with Congress.
Yeah, so Congress is taking a stab at a bill that would regulate autonomous vehicles, or not necessarily regulate is the right word, but create a framework to regulate. And so they tried last Congress, the 115th Congress, and it failed in the Senate. And so this round they're working both the House Energy and Commerce Committee is the lead on the House side, and then on the Senate side it's Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And so the staffs of both those committees this round are creating a bill. They're still in draft form. They haven't introduced anything yet formally. But creating a bill that would touch some of the issues that AV companies are asking for guidance on, like cybersecurity and privacy and safety standards for the cars. And so that bill is in development, still at the draft phase, but that's what Congress is working on right now.
And where do they, where is their, where are their sticking points, and where are there areas of where they agree?
Yeah, so where they agree, if you talk to, so there's 4 key lawmakers on this, the chairman and then the ranking member on the House side, and then chairman and ranking member on the Senate side. They will all say that they think there needs to be some kind of framework to regulate AVs. They want it. The question is what's in that framework. And so one of the sticking points last Congress was about whether if there were a crash in one of these cars, whether the person involved in the crash could sue the automaker or the company involved. and the idea of forced arbitration, whether they should be forced into arbitration with the company. And so that was a sticking issue last time. Forced arbitration was not banned in the bill, and that was an issue that some Democrats in the Senate took with it. And so that's why it didn't succeed last time. We haven't seen them touch that issue yet in the drafts yet, though. So everything that they've touched so far has been relatively non-controversial, not necessarily the sticking points yet.
And is there any sense that they will have success this year? I understand there's an overarching, is it the federal highway authorization that could move things along?
So the committees that are in charge of the highway authorization are a little bit different than who's in charge of who's working on the self-driving car bill. So I talked to Maria Cantwell, who's the ranking member on the Senate side of Commerce a while ago now, to say, would this be possible to maybe attach a self-driving car item to this bigger highway bill? And they weren't envisioning that at that point. So right now, from my knowledge of talking to people, they see them being separate. I can't say yet how much success this bill will have this year, given that it's an election year, given that they haven't touched the stickier issues yet. Once we have an actual bill introduced, I might be able to say, okay, this is the outlook, but at this point, there's not even a bill on the table yet, so it's kind of early to say.
And Catherine, what's your crystal ball say?
Well, I agree with everything that you said. I mean, it's an election year, so it makes it difficult to tell. There is a lot of pressure to get a bill passed. The uncertainty in the marketplace is very difficult for all of the companies involved. And it's not just a matter of them wanting to understand how they can work through U.S. regulations to get their products made. These are international companies, all of the above, all the tech companies, all the OEMs, and they have to think about issues of international competitiveness. So they have to work in a world with hopefully harmonized regulation, not just in the U.S., but with the EU and with Asian nations. And so there's a lot of concern about either being out of sync with other countries in terms of regulation, or about having an unclear path forward, not knowing what is safe to put on the roads in terms of what you're going to get sued for, and not knowing how your development should be guided in terms of things like connectivity. That comes into play a great deal. And again, as with connectivity, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this a bit, there's a big question about competitiveness. If we don't develop these technologies now in the U.S., does that mean that we are going to be behind other countries who may not have the same values around data use or AI or connectivity as we do here in the U.S.? So it's a big question.
Let's talk about connectivity, and then we can double back to some of these other issues of safety and competition. So Kelly, go ahead and describe the state of play there.
Sure. So connectivity and spectrum issues are regulated by another federal agency, that is the Federal Communications Commission. And they do play a role in transportation and connected issues. In 1999, the FCC, after consulting with DOT, allocated 75 megahertz of spectrum for intelligent transportation systems, essentially dedicating this spectrum for connected vehicle usage. And that comes in a number of different modes. There's vehicle to vehicle, so that vehicles can communicate with each other about their intent and their behaviors, as well as vehicle to infrastructure, so vehicles and infrastructure can communicate, say, for example, change in a traffic signal or change in a railroad crossing signal, as well as pretty much vehicle to everything else. Pedestrians, these days scooters, darn scooters, bikes, motorcyclists. So the vision was that vehicles would be equipped with this, with a radio that would enable these communications, which the hope would be that there would be realized safety benefits as well as environmental benefits, and would also help reduce and ease congestion. So back in the 90s, the only game in town was one form of technology called dedicated short-range communications, which is a Wi-Fi based communication system. And because it was the only game in town back in the 90s, the FCC restricted the rules, the service rules, to allow only that type of communication in the band. So that was the only technology allowed in the band. Flash forward 20 years later, unfortunately, we have not seen any meaningful deployment of DSRC technology in the band. And in the interim, other stakeholders have voiced interest in the band. One is a competing new technology called cellular vehicle to everything technology, which emerged several years back. It's a cellular-based form of vehicle to everything technology, backed, leveraged by years of experience and research in the cellular community. Also, Wi-Fi unlicensed proponents have expressed for years interest in this band because it is considered to be beachfront property in terms of spectrum, and unlicensed advocates have long been arguing before the FCC that the band should be split up and that either unlicensed should share with DSRC or the technology, transportation technologies, or it should be segmented. So back in 2018, a relatively new trade association, one that I work with called 5G Automotive Association, filed a waiver request with the FCC asking that its members, or that it be allowed to use the upper 20 megahertz of spectrum for this new technology called C-V2X. It then, a few months later, filed a full band plan proposal requesting essentially the full band for C-V2X with a small reserved sliver of 10 megahertz for any DSRC uses. Flash forward a few months, the FCC recently released rulemaking, which is where we're at today, considering taking a fresh look at the 5.9 band and how it should be used. And that rulemaking is open right now. Comments are due at the FCC in a few weeks, with reply comments due in April. And what the commission has proposed essentially is to allocate the upper 20 megahertz for cellular vehicle to everything, the lower 45 for unlicensed use, and then there's an open question as to the remaining middle 10 as to whether that should go to C-V2X, remain for DSRC. And that's where we're at right now. It's a very active. It will be a very active proceeding. There are a lot of stakeholders that are very interested. The view of 5GAA, and I think momentum in the industry at large, is that C-V2X is superior to DSRC. DSRC has had its day. C-V2X has a lot of industry momentum. Field test studies have shown that its radio performance is superior to DSRC, and there are a lot of other cost efficiencies and accelerated deployment efficiencies as well.
I think it's probably an issue that a lot of journalists and even just car owners aren't aware is even in the background.
Right.
They're thinking about security issues, privacy issues, safety issues, and there's this whole spectrum issue.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all really related to the same goal, which is road safety and environmental and congestion benefits. They all kind of work together.
Without the connectivity, you really don't get a lot of the benefits that you're going to see with these vehicles. I mean, automated and connected, you often hear those two words together for a reason. It's a orders of magnitude more once they are connected to everything.
So does that bring us back to the international competition then? I mean, these issues that are still very much in flux in the United States, whether it's the spectrum issues, the NHTSA rules, et cetera, how is the United States faring against international competition with autonomous vehicles?
So I tend to think of it as kind of a basket of issues. I think of it as autonomous vehicles, but really it's a practical expression of AI, artificial intelligence, and then also issues around data and privacy, and then of course the connectivity issues. And in any regulatory issue, a country that has a centralized government and is able to say, for instance, as China did, we're going to have 10% of the cars on the road by 2030 are going to be AVs, and they back that up with, research and development money, and of course there's government involvement in the private companies to make sure that that goal is achieved. That is that's a formidable force. In the U.S., we have kind of more of a multi-stakeholder discussion around these policies. We don't actually have it all at one time. So for instance, you're going to see these issues that are, I think, now being resolved through the rulemaking around DSRC and C-V2X and who gets the spectrum and who doesn't. This was, where we are today is the culmination of a lot of stakeholder discussions, a lot of debates, a lot of testing, a lot of work, and a lot of dedication on behalf of a lot of people. But it was more of a multi-stakeholder discussion in order to kind of bring everybody onto the same page. Again, sometimes those are, I think, slower policy debates, and we have to do things like rely on Congress to get some work done on their part, and the administration as well. And I think we all know that sometimes they have to go through their processes, and that can take some time. So yes, there is a lot of competition. There's a lot of concern about, will the regulatory structure kind of hold us back? And what's really at stake, as I said before, it's not just about who gets to the marketplace first. It's not just about who gets rewarded for creating these technologies or, making sure the societal benefits are understood. It's also a lot about the ethics of the situation. China and other countries view kind of issues around AI, around data use, much differently than we do. We have different feelings about individual rights. We have different feelings about individual privacy, about what the state can get in terms of information about us. And other countries don't necessarily have those same thoughts. So it's not only a discussion and concerns about the actual products and who actually gets to market, it's also a larger conversation that's going on about how will these products be used and what will the standards be, not just kind of the engineering standards, but also the standards of practical reality. How will these technologies be used with citizenry all around the world? Mm-hmm. How are we really going to get those benefits?
Mm-hmm. Let's pull up that KPMG graph, Tyler, the one that shows the country rankings. And Catherine, I'm wondering if you can explain
Sure.
what those rankings mean.
Sure.
There we go.
Okay, so KPMG creates an AV readiness index every year, and they are ranking here how ready the country is to deploy AVs. And they measure this by certain factors such as, where's the policy, where's the legislation, where is the actual technology being created by the companies in this country, is the infrastructure ready for it? Are they equipped with C-V2X and other parts of infrastructure that will enable deployment? And so, as you can see, the ranking there says that countries like the Netherlands, Singapore, Norway, they're more ready for this technology than we are. Now, some of us might argue that has something to do with the fact that they are smaller countries, more compact infrastructure. You don't have to make the same capital outlays. And they are also kind of more homogenous communities. The United States, we're obviously covering a much bigger area. And we have, for instance, different climates to account for when we're dealing with making cars safe to drive in different environments. But the fact is we fell last year to number 4, and the reason why KPMG sent the U.S. south in terms of its competitive score is because of the regulatory issue. There's uncertainty, as you said, mm-hmm. and it does. I think it creates a chill on folks deciding where to invest.
Mm-hmm. And how has the connectivity issue been resolved overseas?
So I was actually going to add to that point. The trend line is again towards CV to X. International harmonization is a very important issue from a technology and a spectrum policy perspective. China allocated spectrum for CV to X, and in fact, 13 Chinese auto manufacturers have committed to start deploying CV to X. So, the United States does risk falling behind if it does not adopt an allocation for CV to X, because that does seem to be what other countries are, that China at the very least seems to be moving towards. And in Europe, they at one point were favoring DSRC, but they have since backed out from that position and are now assessing a more tech-neutral approach.
Is that the EU or?
Yes.
Okay. So, Courtney, when you're covering Congress, do you have any sense that there's any sense of urgency in Congress to, step up so that those KPMG ratings don't look so dismal for the United States? I mean, is there any drive, any urgency that you see?
Depends on who you ask, and I wouldn't say it's partisan necessarily. There are two leaders on the Senate side on this issue, Senator Thune, who's a Republican, and Senator Peters, who's a Democrat from Michigan. They're both pushing ahead on this, and then you have folks who are more wanting to take a step back. Congresswoman Schakowsky, who's in the House, she's the chairwoman for the subcommittee that handles this stuff. She said last week, I'm not so crazy about us just speeding ahead. I want us to speed ahead or move ahead carefully. I don't feel the urgency to do this today. So it's not necessarily partisan, depends on who you ask, but some people have urgency, some people not so much.
And the Department of Transportation and NHTSA regulatory process, are they falling behind other countries or?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. It kind of depends on how you look at it. I mean, the traditional process would be to, if there was some kind of policy that they wanted to implement around a certain technology that went into a traditional vehicle, they'd do a lot of research and there'd be a lot of thought, and then they would come out with what's called an FMVSS, a Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. That's right. And that FMVSS would percolate throughout the industry, and it would, create very specific standards for a vehicle and how it could work. Now that we're talking about digital technologies and technologies that are, by their nature, often iterative. You come out with version 1, version 2, version 3. That whole process of creating VMFSs is much more difficult when you apply it to that digital sphere. So part of the legislation has to do with, can we create exemptions to the regular process? And how many exemptions can we create? And, how does that affect development? If we create an exemption, should we be capturing information from that company that we've given an exemption to? And so it's kind of a big question. How do we, are we still really talking about automotive technologies? Are we still really talking about tech company technologies? Where is that sweet spot where we can get the innovations, where we can get all the benefits, and we are, still making sure that we are respecting people's concerns, making them feel safe, and still being competitive in the international marketplace. It's a lot to balance.
And I would say one of the things that I've heard from former auto regulators is that you need data to build regulation. You need information from these car companies about accidents, how they're building it. You need communication between the regulator and the companies. And that's not happening at this point a ton. If we use the parallel of airplanes, which the Department of Transportation also oversees, every time there's a crash, there's data sharing. That's not happening with the autonomous vehicles at this point, and that might be because of commercial interests. One company doesn't really want other companies to know what they're testing. So part of what's significant about the exemption process, and there was a company, it's either last week or the week before, that was granted the first ever exemption. They're called Neuro. They're going to be sharing data about they want to use these self-driving cars to deliver groceries. They're going to be sharing data with regulators about their cars. And so that might be the start of, and this is just my analysis speaking, the start of more data sharing so that eventually the regulators could get to a point where they could build regulation.
And is that a function of companies feeling very proprietary toward
Sure.
their invention?
Sure. Yeah, it takes a lot of capital to get this, to create these innovations. They invest quite a lot. And when you're talking about, for instance, an OEM, the margins aren't huge compared to other industries. If you're talking about, a traditional automotive company versus, for instance, a traditional tech company or even a healthcare company, your profit margins are a bit slimmer, and it is a little bit tenuous. I mean, it's a very difficult process to build a car. Again, 50,000 parts, and you have to deal with all of the suppliers, and you have to deal with the entire supply chain, and hope you don't have a pandemic and a company in a country where you're producing something. It's not easy, as I think Elon Musk discovered and said in despair to the press at one point. So it's an interesting, it's definitely. As a policymaker, I would imagine part of the calculation would be we want to encourage companies to go into the space, to invest all of this money, to take this risk, to create these products on spec essentially, because we don't have standards for them that are completely written out. So you want to encourage that kind of risk-taking because the potential benefits are so huge in terms of safety. I think it's important to mention we lose nearly 35,000 people a year on the roads. I mean, it's an incredible number. I mean, if you think about it, it's 100 people. It's people have died right during this hour while we've been talking. It's absolutely unconscionable. And if we can take away that risk as well as provide benefits for the climate because we don't have crashes anymore and nobody gets stopped. Even lifestyle benefits like somebody gets to go home to see their daughter's baseball game. It's really important in terms of, we say it's important for saving lives, saving time, saving money. And as a policymaker, I think one of the reasons why they have kind of let the regulatory environment be a light touch environment is because the potential benefits are so big. The question is, I think, how far does that go? And when do you have to where do you have to rein that in? Where do you have to create standards? And when does that happen? So that's what we're doing.
Well, let's double back to the safety issues. There have been some crashes that have
the
made,
babies.
probably had a chilling effect on the development or maybe the rulemaking or legislation process. I mean, where have you seen that play out?
Yeah.
I would say, so the most prominent crash that I hear about is what happened in Tempe, Arizona in 2018. So that was an Uber self-driving test car with a person behind the wheel. So most of the time, at least when I've seen when they're testing self-driving cars, you have someone called a safety driver behind the wheel who's ready to take over in case someone needs to. And the car struck a pedestrian who was crossing the street. The safety driver wasn't paying attention at the moment, and that woman passed away. And so, not the safety driver, but the pedestrian. And so there's some key lawmakers that have really magnified that incident, especially in the Senate, I've found, that have, when I ask them, should we be moving ahead on AV policy, they'll say, well, this is what gives me pause. And so that particular accident is one that pops up for me a lot. And it's very ironic, so to speak, because the big argument with AVs is that these are going to be safer. The computer could eventually be safer than the human. Most car crashes are caused by the human doing something wrong. And so the fact that we had a crash by a computer kind of freaks people out a little bit for sure.
Yeah. This is where I think it's really important for people to understand the different levels of automation. I feel like, in some of these crashes that have occurred, you have a vehicle on the road that is probably a level 2 automated vehicle, maybe a level 3, argument can be made, but it's not a fully automated vehicle. And so there's kind of this, this danger zone where you have the human interacting with the vehicle, and humans really don't make perfect decisions. And they get distracted easily, and they drink, and they don't, we're not great on the roads all the time. I mean, except for all of us at this table, that's, but that's how humans think. I mean, we think, I'm a great driver. It's the only problem is the people around me. We're full of all kinds of misinformation like that. And so while the, level 5 automation, will certainly end the problem of, human error wherever you substitute a level 5 vehicle for a human driver, I think we have to contend with this middle period where people need to be very well educated about, is my vehicle a level 2? Is it level 3? Is it level, what does that mean? And, how involved do I have to be? How far can I let my guard down? And I think that's a question that everybody is still working on. But it's certainly a crucial discussion to be had.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on to resources for journalists, are there other things that you all think we haven't discussed that we should touch on here?
I would say that the rulemaking process for me as a reporter is a little bit difficult to understand. Mm-hmm. And so there's the agency that is in charge of the rulemaking process in this space is NHTSA. Mm-hmm. And so understanding how we get from, there's legislation in Congress which is going to prompt NHTSA eventually to issue regulations or get to that point. Congress does not make the rules here necessarily. Congress sets the framework. The agency makes the rules. So I think that's helpful to kind of separate the two, that there's not just one government player in this.
Well, it turns out there are there are several.
I mean, in terms of resources for anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into connectivity and spectrum issues, I would encourage folks to go visit the FCC's website. You can access the full docket for the 5.9 rulemaking in the FCC's online filing system, which is called ECFS. Mm-hmm. You can access comments that are filed, reply comments, ex partes, which are just notices of when stakeholders have gone in, recordations of when stakeholders have gone in to talk with FCC officials. So that's one resource that I would recommend.
And we will make a link to that available
fantastic.
to the journalists.
Excellent, yeah. Excellent. And then the other resource I would direct listeners to is just the 5GAA website, where there are the field test results from CVDX and DSRC are available and can be reviewed. Also takes a deeper dive into what CVDX is, and also shows the 130 plus members that are now part of that organization, which is a real cross section of the new transportation landscape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Catherine?
I mean, we have some of the information here, presented with this webinar. I would say, of that information, I consider the video on the different levels of automation the most important. I would just ask journalists whenever they're covering something or they're asking questions to make it very clear if they're talking about level 5 full automation, if they're talking about, level 2, cars with maybe some ADAS systems involved. I think that one of the underreported stories associated with this, and there are quite a few, is how the earlier stages of what we would consider AV have actually made cars safer already. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have seen fatalities go down, even though we are driving, more miles per capita, even though we have things like, looser marijuana laws any time that happens in a state, the fatality rates go up. But overall, we are seeing fatality rates go down because of things like automatic emergency braking and all of these different technologies that people may not think of as automated, vehicle technologies, but they are the little pieces that when you combine them together and, put them in a vehicle with, different sensor capabilities and the other supporting infrastructure, that's what's going to make up an automated vehicle level 5, as everybody else is thinking about. So I would just encourage folks to take a look at that and think about it.
And the ICC is a good resource for journalists.
We try.
Courtney?
So if there's local reporters watching in different states, when the federal government has not regulated in this area, have created their own policies. Last time I checked, there were at least 29 states that had some kind of statement out about this.
Oh, right. Actually, could we pull up that map of state activities on autonomous vehicles? We missed that.
Yeah, so last time this map will help, but there's executive orders, there's legislation, so I think it's helpful. This map came from the National Council of State Legislatures, they're short NCSL, and so they have guides on their website about what the rules look like in particular states. So if you're trying to figure out, for example, what companies are testing in your states, some state DMVs will keep a list of some sort. California, you have to get a permit to be able to do it, and they publish that permit list, which is huge for journalists because we can see what companies are testing. So I would really check out what the state laws say so that you can use that to mine for information.
Actually, we do have a question here. Someone asked, how do insurance companies fit into the regulation or development of AV technologies? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Not as familiar with that one.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, different insurance companies have different stances on the issue. I mean, they're probably dealing with questions around, certainly around liability. They want to know who's going to pay for what. They're dealing with issues of, I'm sure they want to encourage the technology as well. Obviously, if it saves lives and prevents injury, it's going to help them. But a lot of the question is also around data. These are essentially mobile data machines just sucking in data, and not just about the movement of the vehicle, but about, where the driver is, about the environment around the vehicle. And so, some of the questions around data do involve the insurance companies from their perspective, and different insurance companies have different thoughts about who should own the data and who should control it, and how much people should, how much the government should have access to, how much they should have access to. So it's an interesting question, and I would also point out it's not necessarily just applied to the insurance companies. There are many folks in this area who think about data, and that's kind of their main focus as related to these technologies.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time today. So our thanks to Kelly Donahue, a lawyer for Wilkinson Barker Knauer, Catherine McCullough of the Intelligent Car Coalition, and Courtney Rosen, a reporter for Bloomberg Government. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.